We'll begin our session now. My name is Arturo Valenzuela. I'm here with Covington and Burling, that is a partner of the GrowthNet, one of the knowledge partners. It's a law firm in Washington, D.C., an international law firm. I'm also a professor of government at Georgetown University and was recently in the Obama administration as Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere. Our session today is actually a very fascinating one, a very complex one. It has to do with how do we develop a long-term vision or a long-term national agenda as we move forward in our countries. Given the enormous economic, demographic, and other sorts of pressures, political, social, how do countries set this kind of an agenda? How do we develop a course that will implement the necessary reforms, that will establish the proper strategies, that will help us understand what directions we need to take in order to be able to succeed in this 21st century? This is what we're going to be discussing today. This requires probably strong institutions. It requires the rule of law. It requires effective governance. It requires an international system of rules to be able to work together that we can all agree on. That is what we're hoping to develop. These challenges are not just the challenges of the GrowthNet countries as we know nowadays. It's also the challenges of Europe, the United States. You know, we're all facing the same issue of how do we develop viable national agendas to face the challenges of this time. I'm delighted to be joined on this panel. It's a large panel. In fact, not everyone that you see right here is on the panel because one of our panelists, we just didn't have a chair for her and she decided to sit there. Aru Maida is a member of the Planning Commission of India. We're delighted to have him here with us. Rajan Navani is a managing director of the Jetline Group and chairman of the Confederation of Indian Industry, and delighted to have him here as well. Mohan Kaul is the chairman of the Commonwealth Business Council in the United Kingdom. Murat Sungai is a bank board member of the Open Society in Turkey. And finally, last but not least, is Yu Serisawa, who founded the Forma Corporation, and it was a senior advisor for Japan at the World Economic Forum, and she's an advisor also to the Mori Group. So, without further ado, why don't I just simply ask you a simple question, you know, and that is, could we start out then by saying, what are the elements, what are the paramount elements that we need to consider in order to develop a sense of national identity? Mm-hmm. And if I might, I'd like to be able to start with you, if that were possible, then to Aru Maida.
Well, thank you so much. Well, I'm really delighted at how this conversation is shaping up. Here we were just a few, and then we said, well, one more can join in, and she said, well, I can sit there and be part of the conversation. And maybe all of us should be part of this conversation. So it's not we telling them something, but we together shaping something together. And there's a point here. But I want to step back some 3,000 years. In the Old Testament of the Bible, it says, nations without vision shall perish. There's a lesson there. Why will a nation perish if it does not have a vision? What does a vision do? And the lesson is that it's not so much what a vision is, it's what a vision does to a society, a nation, what it enables them to do with the vision. And the key becomes it's the process of shaping the vision together, of understanding the vision, of feeling connected with the vision that enables then the society to work together. So that's one point I'd like to make at the beginning, and just one more perhaps. The second is a vision cannot be a number. It cannot be a number. We have learned this in the corporate world over years, especially the last 20 years, when the whole pursuit of shareholder value was at the ascendant, that describe the vision for your corporation either as a number of how large your revenues will be in some time frame, or how large your market capitalization is going to be in some time frame. So that's okay for the CEO and others, because that's a goal that you could be yourself responsible for. But you ask people who come to work in the warehouse or in the factories, what does the vision mean to them, that we shall have this $100 billion market capitalization? Why would a person want to do anything differently that day for the sake of a $100 billion market capitalization somewhere in the future? How would that influence the behavior of a person? So the vision must be something which makes a person want to do something differently for producing that vision, and therefore the vision must be a description of what life will be like for each of us if we got that vision. Therefore, a vision of a nation cannot be the size of its GDP. It has to be what would be the character of our society, the character of our environment, relationships amongst ourselves, a vision of that. And that I can see of value to me in my life every day, and also something I can do something about also. It's my behaviors, my actions with others to do that. So the process of shaping a vision must describe a variety of things which fit together in a system, and can't be, once again I repeat, just numbers, and certainly cannot be just one number. And I think we've got a bit trapped in the last few years, and this is probably a caution for us in the emerging world, to not just pursue the GDP and the GDP growth as our vision, but rather what type of society, what type of nation, what type of country are we aiming to be? I'll just stop there with those 2 points.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Well, just a little correction. I chair the India at 75 initiative of the Confederation of Indian Industry, and I'm going to kind of share, my experience or my thoughts on a vision based on the India at 75 experience, basically, which is a vision for India and the potential for what India can be by 2022. That's the year when India completes 75 years of its independence. And when we went around this process, trying to see what should this vision be, how do you really craft a vision, and what are the factors that really you need to take into account, I think there were 4 very clear factors that stood out for us. One was, of course, the vision has to be a shared aspiration of the people of the country. Irrespective of the cross-section of people, irrespective of who the people are, it necessarily needed to be something that is a shared aspiration that plugs into that. The way we went about saying it, that there should be some non-negotiables of the journey of achieving this vision. There are certain things that one needs to definitely make sure are non-negotiable. The third point was, of course, it should be aspirational. It has to be something that one needs to stretch out for, because I think that's where the inspiration, the motivation, the excitement of that journey comes about. And in most growing economies or growth-oriented economies where there are limited resources, that transformation is really a transformation of an entrepreneurial kind. You start with low resources, very high aspirations. So it is that kind of a transformation that we are talking about in a country, and particularly in India. And of course, the fourth point that we kind of put through was that it needed to be dated and objective. So while Arun said you do not really put a number, we felt by putting a number, there's definitely an order of magnitude of change that one is talking about. It's not necessarily about really achieving that number, but achieving that order of magnitude. So if we really look at India at 75, the method by way of which this vision was actually developed, it was based on a shared aspiration which actually went around the entire country, trying to see first and foremost if there was an aspiration. And interestingly, the last time a country like India came together was around the freedom movement, where there was a shared aspiration for freedom in the 30s and 40s, and we try to see if there is a shared aspiration of that kind today. And this exercise was done 3 years ago. Actually, Arun was the person who was at BCG that time who actually lent his leadership to this whole exercise. And we did find that there was a common aspiration that tied Indians together, and that was the need for a better livelihood for themselves as well as for the next generation. And really, therein came in the concept of, if you were to really look at a better livelihood for people, what better way than enabling them to acquire a skill that would help them, generate that livelihood. And with that, I think, of course, we had Professor C.K. Prahlad from the US who had actually inspired this whole agenda and had set the thing. We went to the Prime Minister of India with the thing that to say that, can India really create a 500 million skilled workforce by 2022? And really that became the cornerstone of the India at 75 vision. Is, we have a demographic dividend. Is it possible to really create a 500 million, skilled workforce? The non-negotiables, of course, for India were, scale. If we look at anything that we need to do in India, it needs to necessarily have scale. It needs to be inclusive. There has to be social equity. India is the paramount ground for price performance. There was a time when the poor in India accepted, an inferior product because they paid a lower price. Not anymore. So we had to ensure that the price performance parameters are absolutely critical. We believe that the rule of law, making sure that all of this is sustainable, that the fact that all the next practices, all the innovations that happen are market driven, are the non-negotiables of this journey that we undertook. Talking of aspirations and high aspirations with limited resources, it was very essential to say that the only way you can bridge that gap is really by creating next practices. I think the fact that a nation of over 1.2 billion people is trying to move from a developing nation to a developed nation is itself a global next practice. I don't think in the history of mankind have we seen a nation so large and so diverse actually move from one domain to the other. But it is also about how do you consume differently, how do you address energy differently, how do you address social security differently. And I think these were the different non-negotiables, and the kind of next practices that we had thought through. So just to kind of put into perspective, these were really the paramount factors that we looked at India at 75 when we were actually trying to create a vision for a national future.
Thanks. Mohan?
Thank you. As Arun said, every country, large or small, developed or developing countries, has a vision, and or should have a vision. And I think the starting point for the vision is the constitution of a country, and which gives the path to that vision. And every country, when India had a constitution, it developed after a long exercise of involving many facets of people to see what that vision should be. And I remember that in 1995, when I was involved in an exercise of developing a constitution for South Africa, when President Mandela took the presidency, South Africa was very, very keen to develop a very extensive constitution which represented the aspirations of the people. And it resulted into saying the rights to property, rights to education, rights to land, to every citizen is now inside in the Constitution, which provided that path. All the exercises which have resulted into developing the vision are governed by economic issues in most countries. One of the countries that I was involved in is the 2020 vision setting in Malaysia, which was led by Mahathir Mohamad, was actually as a result of the imbalance of economic opportunities for the local Bumiputra Malay population compared to the Chinese population in Malaysia. So 2020 became the vision to address this imbalance and actually set the goal that in 2020, the Malays who were getting preferences at present will not have those preferences. That would be the end of all the preferences, because in 2020, we will achieve in Malaysia an economic growth which has equity for all. That was the goal, and that is the goal at present. The second goal for that exercise was that Malaysia should become the high-income group country by 2020. As a result of that process, a number of projects were identified as is being done in India in 75, and government, but it was primarily a government-led political process. It involved a lot of task forces, private sector involvement, consultations, but it was primarily led by Mahathir Mohamad and the present government now. In contrary, the second exercise, which you would have heard by Kibati of Kenya, who, if he was there, which is the Vision 2030 of Kenya, which again came into action only after the bloodbath of the Kenya election 5 years ago, when many of the communities reacted because they felt they were disfranchised. And so therefore, this 2030 task force of vision was set up by President Kibati. But the difference was the chairman of the 2030 committee, who is leading this, is a private sector, is the chairman of Equity Bank. And the whole task force, again, consultative process, similar to here, government and private sector, but it's led by private sector under the government umbrella. And it again has number of projects. Now, advantage of this exercise is that you reduce the bureaucracy because these projects go through a single point and do not have to go through the proper process. You also achieve, all of these projects are likely to achieve those economic objectives to reduce the imbalance. And it also comes out with a lot of innovation. I think once you set these targets, people unleash the innovations, they work together. And I think one of the things which these exercises is people work together and are innovative. This 2030 exercise, again, is supposed to be in Kenya, again, a very successful process. And if you can see already a result because we were expecting, I mean, that there would be a real problem in Kenya on this election. And I was promised by all Kenyans that nothing will happen, this will go peacefully, and it did go peacefully. So already we can see the result of this exercise, which was as a result of involving the national consensus. The other exercises that I've been involved in, say in Mozambique or Ghana, all these are economically driven where the countries are setting the goal that we want to become from a least developed country to a medium, middle income country or whatever, and go in that direction. And so in my view, most of these exercises is economic, reducing economic imbalance. As far as growth countries are concerned, one of the things which, I mean, World Bank and others have written that the development in growth economies, China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, to a lesser extent in Turkey or in Africa, the development is going to be very different than what was in Western economies because these are going to be the house or home to large number of most extremely poor people at the same time alongside living extremely rich people. These imbalanced pockets of economy is going to be the shape of this growth economies. This is what is likely to happen. So it's very timely or is very important that all the growth economies are able to look at a vision which reduces this imbalance. I think that should be the most important thing, which is probably already happening. But I think this imbalance of having the most rich and the most poor in the same countries at the same time will really create the imbalance and therefore should be the main focus of how to reduce this inequity. Should be the focus of this vision exercise. Thank you. I think I'll stop.
Thanks very much. Let's see, why don't we turn to you next?
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, I will try to respond to your question by trying to explain what I understand from long-term vision. I think long-term vision should set the stage for a certain target and not necessarily with a time frame. It should be rather a continuous process. It should be, certainly in a democratic system, it should be above governments so that there should not be any challenge to this long-term vision. And it should be certainly accepted by the majority of the people, obviously. And once a policy or a vision is accepted as a long-term process, it generates a bipartisan goal, and opposition to it by anybody becomes virtually impossible. So that long-term vision really sets the stage for a certain, not a certain period, for a continuous process. And in the next stage, I will try to explain the situation in Turkey, what kind of long visions we had and we still have since the establishment of the Republic. So in that regard, it will be the pragmatic side of looking into what a vision is from a Turkish perspective.
Good, thank you very much. Turn to you.
Thank you. So I'm the only speaker, I think, that represents the old constellation of stagnation. So I think I was invited to this panel to give maybe a counter example or a model not to follow. But let us look back toward the times that Japan was considered indeed a model. The Look East policy, for instance, of Prime Minister Mahathir still sounds familiar. But outside of Japan, we are really all too familiar with the so-called Japan miracle. And of course, that's just the name of the phenomenon. And behind it, we truly had policy. Maybe not just a policy, maybe a national agenda. But now I know why. And Mr. Myra very kindly gave me the answer why actually this was not a real vision. And actually also Mr. Sungari also said there's no time frame, because in 1960 what drove the Japan miracle was the Prime Minister Ikeda's plan to double the national income. He just gave that, stating that starting 1961 we would double our national income in 10 years. And that was the goal set. And under this very simple goal, all the policies, all the legislation, everybody, like you said, Mr. Navani, there was a shared aspiration. Everything from corporate behavior to individual behavior, everything was aligned. I think alignment is a key word when you have a vision and when you have a national agenda. And then everything is aligned in a very meticulous way and in a very disciplined way. That's how I think Japan miracle happened. And when you remember, for instance, even in energy policy, in 1955, only 10 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, we were able to implement the nuclear power legislation, and we did indeed. And now with Fukushima, which was very, very tiny in terms of actual radiation compared to the bombings, we now totally shutting down our nuclear power, and that's really due to very emotional sort of reaction and not rational economic decision, I think. Also, maybe consider the technology. For instance, the bullet train technology was introduced in 1964. I was happy to read yesterday as I was landing in India that at least on the Japanese newspaper, India apparently has or will decide to introduce our Japanese system, a bullet train system here. But anyway, so that miracle was launched, and Japan doubled its GDP in 6 years. It's a real term per capita income in 7 years. And in 68, the Japanese economy surpassed that of the West Germany to become the second largest economy in the world. And that growth was actually supported also, I was saying alignment, but with this very a large growing urbanized middle class. And indeed, in 1970, there was a national survey. No, more than 98% of the Japanese considered themselves middle class. And also this very key word of 100 million middle class nation was also launched. So unlike the US government's perception that Japanese growth was mainly sustained by exports, of course we did good in exports too. But actually in the 60s, it was indeed the domestic market that drove the growth. We had another expression, the three God's tools, and one was TV, washing machine, and refrigerator. And then in the late 60s to 70s, it was the three C's, so the car, color TV, and cooler, which is air conditioning. So all of that really was expanding all throughout Japan, and we got it. However, the problem started there in 68 when we caught up. Then what happened? And that's why I think I agree with Mr. Navani that we should have an aspiration. But Mr. Maria said, if it's a figure, it's not a vision. And this was a figure, and this had a time frame. That's why we lacked vision from the first time anyway, I think. But when we caught up, we totally lost it. We totally lost the national agenda because we caught up, and we were unable to make a new national agenda. And so people are talking about lost 2 decades, but for me, the problems already started in the early 70s. And it's like if Japan was a car, and then we really was standing there without being able to move. So of course we put gear in low gear, right? And then maybe we got to the second gear, and the second gear got us really started. But I think in the 70s, as we caught up, we were driving on the highway on the second gear. And so we burnt up our machine, we burnt up our motor. And so I think that was the bubble economy in the late 80s with all the problems that ensued and with the ensuing 20 years of 2 lost decades. So I think we were serving as now a counter model for many countries, for many emerging countries. And I think that in many ways, the Chinese, for instance, are trying to avoid the bitter mistakes we made. And they're very good at, for instance, they're dealing with their exchange rate vis-a-vis the US dollar in order to avoid the Plaza Accord, for instance. They're very agile in strategic recycling of their trade surplus also. Or indeed, the liberalization, very prudent way of liberalization of their financial markets. So I think the national agenda, I would agree with all the other speakers, is formed through a delicate balance of people mindsets, policies, political leadership, and other input from media or thought leaders from that country. But I think that the growth net countries would certainly come up with not just a national agenda, but 2 national agendas, one for growth and one for post-growth. Thank you.
I'm wondering if I could push you a little bit, and I don't mean to pick on you.
Okay.
But what really, if the vision was lost, perhaps because it was too focused on GDP growth, which was an interesting point that you made earlier, that in fact, we can't just simply look at numbers, we have to have something that's more substantive, far more. What is then required now? How do you get this vision back? Is it really simply exchange rates, or is there something about a national commitment? And how do you translate that into a? I guess what I'm getting at is we need some more concrete things here about what it is that leads to creating this kind of national vision. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts yourself about where Japan ought to go concretely. How do you do this?
We've been searching for 20 years, so I really doubt it. I really don't know what it is, which could be simple enough for people, everybody to really support it without any conflict, and simple enough and good enough. And in a way, we lukewarmly in a comfortable daily life, and that prevents us from being really focused on any national agenda. I'm afraid. Maybe the threat of China or North Korea, maybe.
A negative threat. Right. Yes.
I wanted to come in.
Sure.
I think that we've raised some very interesting issues about the nature of the vision which will endure and enable a society to always have a vision before it, rather than a number and a time which is over, and then what? And so we go back to Mahatma Gandhi, and Rajan raised that. Mahatma Gandhi's vision was of a society that we should aspire to be. And he was very clear that we could even postpone the date of our freedom from the British if it was going to come in the way, our urgency to do that was going to come in the way of our being the sort of society that we want to be. Please remember that. Yes, his vision was a vision of a society, of a type of society that we must aspire to be, which would be affecting the conditions of everyone, the poorest, and of course the rich would have to be participant in creating a society that they would want to be living in and be proud of also. So this tells us something about the nature of the vision that Mahatma Gandhi used to be able to inspire everybody. If it had been by so-and-so day we will get so-and-so GDP, I can't imagine all Indians rallying around, or even by so-and-so day we're going to get our freedom. And he kept resisting that. He says, no, that's going to be short-sighted. We will then use means to achieve the date and the quantitative result, which will just destroy the character of who we want to be. And the same thing happens in the corporate side. When you set visions in terms of numbers and times, shortcuts are taken because that number and the time becomes paramount. So it's the means, the who we are, and not what we have, that is extremely important. Now, yes, she said very well, something simple to engage the whole nation of Japan with. It's tough with the less than 200 million people in Japan, more homogeneous. Well, we've got 1.2 billion and pretty heterogeneous. How do you engage such a large nation with a vision for itself? And he mentioned the work that we did in getting the India at 75 work going. I mean, it was telling us some thoughts about the challenges of engaging diverse people in talking about the country that they want to shape together. And as we went into the 12th plan, when I joined the Planning Commission thereafter, now yes, we've got to engage with India. Now, how do you engage 1.2 billion people to be part of a national conversation about what is the vision for India to drive not just this plan, but the next, and as you said, forever perhaps, but something that you keep getting towards, some excellence that you're striving for. And we realize that the processes by which people are included in this conversation are the key. And it's not simple. You can very easily say, like we said, oh, well, now that we have the internet and social media, put it out there, the question, and you'll get a lot of responses. Well, within a few hours, you have millions. You can't make sense of it. And neither can anyone on that conversation make sense of the others. So we are getting into learning how a large society can have a conversation with itself about what it wants to be. It's a matter of technique and technology also. And these techniques are not merely information technology techniques, but the techniques of listening,
And
affirming.
leadership.
But the leadership comes here by Mahatma Gandhi is acknowledged as a leader because people felt he understood them. Then I allow you to lead me because you understand me. So that's the first step. Am I listening to you? Do I speak your heart when I speak? And then will you follow me as I go? Because we are going the same way now and do this. So the skills of leadership are to be different. They can't be top-down telling people what to do. The skills of leadership require today, especially in a more diverse democratic world, the ability to really listen and for people to know you've heard them. Therefore, to get permission to lead them.
Yes. Now that you have mentioned about Gandhi, let me point out that there is one long-term vision in the history of Turkish case since the establishment of Turkey, and that is really reaching the highest standards of contemporary civilization, as we call it. This is enshrined in the Turkish constitutions, and it has been the guiding light for consecutive governments. This was never challenged. There were misinterpretations of this vision, but certainly even today we have a conservative government, as they label themselves, yet they are trying to become a full member of the European Union, for example, which, again, within the context of this long-term vision, that Turkey should adopt the values of Western standards, values meaning democracy, secularism, rule of law, and respect for human rights. These are the general umbrella of what we are trying to do. So such visions should be broad enough to encompass really many aspects of social life. And in that regard, reaching the, as I said, contemporary civilization standards has been the guiding light for the Republic since even today.
Can I just add on that? I mean, I agree that Constitution, like was said, provides that light, which is what in India or anywhere else, a written Constitution or otherwise has provided. I do not agree that there would be a single vision for a time period for eternity. It may be Japan or India, or the conditions of people change. The technology changes, the leadership needed at one level is completely different than the leadership needed at a different level. And so the conditions, you can't have a single vision without, when you reached that vision like Japan, what else? You've got to have a new vision to drive that. I think at present the vision for India is to achieve growth with equity. Or India or China or Indonesia or wherever, or Africa. That is the main problem, and the leadership, the technology, the people needed that. It's not a figure, it's equity. I mean, whatever is that. So I think it will look, it's completely inhumane if in 20 years of time we will have such imbalances in these countries. So therefore, but once we have achieved those, probably 20 years time, 30 years time, definitely the vision to the next 30 years will be very different than when we achieve this. So having a single vision for eternity is really, it's not possible. So therefore, we may have a path, we might have a growth, we may have what kind of society we have, which is what every constitution determines. I like the Americans, when they quote Constitution every time, they refer to Constitution when they refer for American aspiration or America. So I think I am very taken by that. So therefore, I do not see a vision which is completely, single vision for eternity. I think visions change for every country.
I want to give some chance for others to participate, but Rajan?
Yeah, I'll just, take your point. I think, one really needs to also look at the country and the way the country is structured, right? So in India, we have definitely a very strong society and a government that is, is trying to deliver to its optimum levels, whereas, we often say that we just send somebody to China, see how it's done there, come back and kind of execute here. It doesn't necessarily work the same way. So if we are looking at creating a 500 million skilled workforce in India and we say that this is the job of the government, well, it's not going to, be the way. So the way it is actually happening with India at 75, because you did raise this, so the government actually set up something called the National Skills Development Corporation, which has a mandate to create 150 million skilled workers of a particular type over the next decade. Corporate India has actually come on, and different corporations are taking leadership to say, okay, we will skill 1 million people, we will skill 1.5 million or 2 million in areas that will benefit our corporation, but also do a much larger good. And now we have foundations and NGOs and civil society that is also coming together. Like we recently had a foundation in India which actually said, we will take up 5% of that target, to kind of skill 25 million people over the next decade. So we see civil society participating and actually becoming a very collaborative effort. And that's where, a number, I'm going back to not necessarily defending, as I said, it's an order of magnitude. We cannot as a country be happy if we have tens of millions of skilled people in the next, 10 years, because we have a huge population. We have, 1 in 10 people in the world is an Indian under 25. And what's that guy going to do, if he doesn't have a skill to be able to put it out? So it is really a collaborative process, and it is different from a country to a country. But also to take Ms. Sherizeva's point about Japan, and it's also where the start out point is. So if you really look at where India is starting out, having an objective goal, working towards something which is more concrete, definitely is required. But in a longer term, it necessarily needs to change. So we often say that this is a marathon. It's going to go India at 75, going to go India at 100, and we got to run it in 400-meter sprints. So you got to set targets, get there, then go to the next step. So just wanted to keep that point.
I want to turn it over now to some participants, but I have to make a comment along these lines. Isn't there at the beginning of the 21st century a significant difference between countries that have visions because they already have national identity? They may lose some of that vision, but the point I'm trying to make is that isn't there a difference between countries that have a national identity already and countries that are still struggling to create that national identity? And if we lose sight of the fact that in many places of the world today, subalternate loyalties, religious loyalties, tribal loyalties, ethnic loyalties, regional loyalties are trumping the idea of trying to create a national identity, then you have a really serious problem. It's what the Italians call irredenta, which is the whole notion of each of the subalternate loyalties wanting to establish their own state, a sovereign state. And that's what's tearing much of the fabric of the world apart. You see this, of course, in the Middle East in a very significant way. Countries that are not nations. They are proto-nations in that sense. And so then that's an even greater challenge, because if we have a challenge in Japan that has a very strong national identity in creating a vision, how much more difficult is it in a country like Libya today because of these subalternate loyalties?
Or India.
Or India, in that sense. And I think both of these examples are really interesting ones, because you have a long struggle in both Turkey and in India to try to create this sense of national identity. And there probably is greater symbolism behind this effort than in other places. But let's not lose track of the fact that you can't have a national vision unless you have a national identity. All right? Any questions? Comments? Yes?
Thanks to Mr. Arun Mehra for reminding us about what Mahatma Gandhi said, that means are equally important and should be noble as much as the end where you want to reach. And he did also mention that there is enough for everyone's need, but not for anybody's greed. Therefore, what is important is, as we aspire to grow, we must preserve the values and cultural fabric of the nation as such. Now, again, referring to Mohan and Navani's points to be merged with your thinking, why not at macro level we pursue what you said, without a number and a kind of a journey, and define the path. But to reach there, progressively, we need to have also a short-term, medium-term milestones to be crossed. And that is why they say every success is an occasion for you to redefine the goal, and every failure is an occasion for you to redefine the methods by which you can improve and achieve. So that thought process, I thought I'll leave it as a comment. And now coming to Japan, while China is concerned about aging population, India is concerned about capitalizing on the youth demographic advantage of the population. Japan's population seems to be the declining population.
Already. Yes.
In absolute terms. So therefore, which is corresponding with some of the developed economies. But maybe some economies are able to manage with migrants. But I don't think Japan has facilitated that migration also so smoothly, or the cultural barriers and so many things. So should your economy not think on redefining the model that suits a lesser number of population as you progress? Maybe that will help you to identify your vision. Thank you.
So firstly, I agree with Mohan's comment about the Constitution being a beacon of the vision. But it's also fair to say that the Constitution says that India is a socialist, secular republic. And one wonders that 65 years after that, one should change that. But the other thing one would comment on is that there was a conspicuous lack of absence of the political side in creating a mission in the discussion. Because at the end of the day, as a democracy, the largest in the world, you cannot create a mission in an abstract technocratic sense unless you involve the population of India, which is a very difficult process, but a very important one. So any comments on that?
Yeah. May I just, I think I said that in this country we've got to involve large numbers of people and diverse people, okay? But that is a political process. You don't have to work necessarily through political parties, but engaging people with their aspirations and their concerns and their obstructions to others. Why do they fear others and obstruct them? That's the larger political process. Political parties come out of representing some of these causes. So we had recognized that we're not going to consult the political parties about what should be the vision for India. We have to consult the people for what should be the vision for India. And yes, it's pretty complex. Constitutions can never serve. And I want to make the point that we've got a constitution, we said the best in the world probably, other than maybe you don't like the socialist part. But there are lots of things in the constitution which we are very proud of. But we know that. We haven't achieved much of that. And Dr. Ambedkar, who was one of the architects, the authors of our constitution, Dr. Ambedkar, he adopted Buddhism afterwards, just after that. Why? Because he realized it's a process. It's not a matter of writing something down. Society has to change itself. And he used the Buddhist term, dukkha, and you'll understand that there is pain and suffering in society. And whereas Buddhism, as he's read it, was personal salvation and relief of personal, you can't escape the personal pain, but how to live with it. A society has to learn to live with pain it will constantly have, which, by the way, when you talk of inequality, you can keep increasing average GDP, but there will always be some who will feel that it's not fair. For some reason or the other, it may not be just income inequality, it could be something else. And to be conscious of the pain of people in your society and to take along the whole society, that's what a vision is, I think. A vision of that sort of society, which was what Mahatma Gandhi was helping us to shape together. So we can't leave it in a constitution alone. It will have to be a process of constantly engaging ourselves with what's the type of society we wish to be, and will never be reached, because there'll always be the pain in it, there'll always be differences, some dissatisfactions, but we'll take ourselves together.
Thank you. I think we have a paradox, and that is that assuming that Turkey is trying to set up as a nation, you know, the nation-state building, which I have my doubts about, because probably in certain aspects we have already done that. The problem is the aim that we have for ourselves, like the European Union membership, is a union which is trying to put aside the nation-state as such and move on to a different sort of sovereignty. And I think there's a contradiction there, which is very difficult to gap for Turkey as well.
Yes?
There were references to two of Gandhi's quotes, and I would like to refer to a third quote, which talks about trusteeship. And the question to Mr. Navani, is your committee looking at the fact is that increasingly crony capitalism, corruption, etc., are sort of acting like termites in our growth story? Thank you.
You know, absolutely.
And have you addressed that issue?
Sure.
I mean, that has been addressed many times in the past, but we only see it worsening.
Sure. No, so, you know, the way it really talks of, when we talk of that inclusive, developed India of 2022, we say there are three pillars on which really that will be built. It's economic strength, technological vitality, and moral leadership. Because I think history has shown that, you know, you can have the first two, but if you lack moral leadership, you know, there's no way you're going to be able to build a nation which will, you know, withstand the state of time and actually, you know, take things forward. So definitely we are looking at seeing how technology can be leveraged to help, you know, also address the issue of moral leadership in some form, particularly in a country like India, you know, where we, if you talk of, you know, just direct corruption and things like that, we're seeing how technology, and we're seeing that
exponential corruption.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So, that's what we're saying. So, at the end of the day, we have to find ways and means by way of which, moral leadership is at the core of anything that India does. But it is not something that's going to be able to happen overnight, right? It's a gradual process, and we've seen that historically, even the Americas or whichever of the countries where they're at. There were times when, it took a while to kind of cross that barrier, but we strongly believe that technology is going to play a large role. And if we look at how government services are being doled out today, how they are being reached out to people, we do believe that technology is going to help address some of that. Also, some of the policies, right? So today, if you really look at, it's often a demand-supply situation. I mean, just look at phones, right? There was a time, 20 years ago, you had to bribe somebody to get a phone. When policies happened, you have so much mobile phone in the market that today every plumber, driver on the road has 800 million mobile phones in India. So, also some right policies, technological things, but definitely your point is very well taken. You cannot create a country which would lack in moral leadership, and that is definitely something we are looking at.
We're going to have to be wrapping up our session soon, but I wanted to turn over to you to maybe
on
the immigration issue.
Yes, on immigration in Japan. Well, actually, one of the conveners for this GrowthNet, Smaja and Smaja, and my company co-organize every year also a roundtable on Japan's medium and long-term future in the global context. And I remember still in 2007, so like 3 months before he became Prime Minister for the first time, Mr. Shinzo Abe was a speaker as a Chief Cabinet Secretary. And one of his major themes was immigration, to our surprise. And he used the keyword of open, and Japan has to become an open society. However, of course, in his first cabinet, which was way too short anyway, he never implemented it. In the second one, he's more talking about Abenomics, etc. So he forgot about maybe that theme. However, because our national identity, the strong national identity, as pointed out by our chairman, is so deeply encrusted. Actually, it's an ethnic one. That's why also it was easier for us, ethnic and even religious, in the sense that we are multi-religious anyway. So, so I think that it will be a challenge. And it will be a challenge because our national identity is never, contrary to the United States, it's never written down. It's not clear. It's more like because we are what we are. Of course, it has to do with Confucianism. That's maybe the only driving line that we have. But that's why I think it's a challenge.
We'll take 2 more comments, and then we'll wrap up the session.
The distinguished delegate here referred to the phenomenon in a country like Japan of a reducing population. When we think and when we talk of the visions for different states or the different nations, the vision has to be fine-tuned also based on the total populations that we have. As Mr. Mara rightly said, the Constitution provides the basis. And I have revisited the preamble to the Constitution maybe 100 times, which sets our vision. But what bothers me today is the ever-increasing population in some of the countries, including my own. When Mahatma Gandhi was around, India's population, including what went to the East Pakistan and to West Pakistan, was just about 400 million. And I don't remember having come across any observations of Mahatma Gandhi on population. But I'm sure if he had been around today, he would have made some observations. My precise question to Mr. Maira and to the distinguished panelists is, when we set goals, when we set our vision, when we redefine our focus, how do you relate it with the total population? In India, in the last 10 years, ably supported by the Supreme Court, we have the accentuation of the right to education, right to employment, and so many other things coming up. How do you correlate one with the other? Are there any limits to the populations in different countries? Thank you.
Thank you. Real briefly, please.
Right here, we have emphasized the need to engage with the public and to sort of develop some kind of consensus before we can make a national vision. In my opinion, the other way around is also very important. It is for the leadership, because in a country diverse as India, it is very difficult to have a consensus on anything. So it is for the leadership to formulate the right kind of ideas for the growth of the country, and then to sell it properly to the diverse public. I am not sure whether this kind of approach is being tried in India or not at the moment.
So I'm going to give an opportunity for just a 1-minute response, if anybody has that, or a 2-minute response from the panel.
I can do it in a minute unless, actually, because I'm going to say something quite corny. I'm going to refer you to read some things which are available, because I can't say it all here. Yes, to the question about the leadership must engage with the people. Yes, the leaders have some questions, they have some thoughts of directions, but they've got to get support from the people, and they might get new questions in that conversation. So we have conducted a conversation this time as we made the 12th plan with millions of people in the country. This is all embodied and described now in a document called Scenarios for India, which are on the Planning Commission's website. And those scenarios explain the challenges that we as a country must address together. Some solutions are being mentioned there also, the ways in which we would be able to address these challenges. So I'd refer you to that. The second is, you mentioned it's very difficult to have a conversation between millions of people, which true is. You notice in that document, Scenarios for India, we are referring to how we went about it. It's been one of the first time I think a country so large has done it, but it's not yet getting us what we wanted. So the second thing I'm selling now is a book I wrote a few years ago called Discordant Democrats, 5 Steps to Consensus, just published by Penguin, which takes for examples of the United States, it takes examples of Japan, Germany. Many countries have the same challenge. I mean, we have it much larger. What are the lessons we are all learning, democracies, in how to engage diverse populations in having something that inspires them all to work together? So that's in Discordant Democrats, 5 Steps to Consensus. Thank you for allowing me to publicize something. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, the copies of the book will be sold in the back here. The author will autograph it, that's right. Well, let me thank the panel for this very interesting conversation today. I think that if I take something out of this discussion, it's that this is not just something of a leaders-led vision that somehow is the proper way to go. I mean, leaders have to lead, but the leaders also have to listen. And if the leaders have to listen, and they have to listen because they have to create consensus. And to create consensus, they need to be able to. And how is that done? That is done through legitimate institutions. It has to be done through legitimate institutions, which in turn leads us back to the notion that in order to be able to move forward at this point in the 21st century, is what we're talking about really is developing democracies that work. Yeah. Developing democracies that work. There is still out there the notion that, oh, well, maybe an authoritarian regime would be able to answer these sorts of questions. Perhaps at certain junctures, at a particular moment of crisis, there may be some truth to that. But I think over the long haul, that is probably unsustainable. And history and examples all over the world show us that unless, particularly at this point in history, when legitimacy comes from the consent of the governed and not from necessarily the divine right of kings or something like that, then it's very, very important to kind of build this kind of, and this answers the question that I raised earlier, and that is the challenge, of course, for divided societies, for multi-ethnic societies, or for societies where subalternate loyalties trump national loyalties is much, much greater. But the answer then is to see how you deepen democratic institutions in those kinds of societies. And something that's left unsaid here, and here I'm putting my political science hat on, is there really are probably different forms of governance. There's a crisis of representation, there's a crisis of accountability, there's probably a crisis of governance in one mix or another in every one of our societies. And the question is, what are the better ways of strengthening political parties, for example? Parties are absolutely essential because they are the transmitting belt between the aspirations of the citizenry and the leadership, and it's the belt also, the proper belt for reaching out also to the citizenry. Because we know that the direct relationship between the Führer or the populist leader and so on and so forth is not necessarily the way to go. You have to, institutions in the final analysis are critical. And institutions have to work in a democratic context in order to be able to have the kind of results you want. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. Great. Good comment.
And that is the continuous process.
And it is a continuous process.
Never ends.
It never ends.